The living room buzzed with the usual forced laughter and chatter of my relatives, but my heart pounded in my chest. My father's voice cut through the noise like a whip. "Sophia, stand up," he barked. All eyes turned to me. My face burned as I reluctantly stood, unsure of what I'd done this time. My parents never needed much of an excuse to make me their scapegoat. My harmless prank, announcing a fake inheritance check at dinner, was the perfect trigger. "You thought that was funny?" my father demanded, his face red with anger. "Embarrassing us like that in front of the whole family? It was just a joke," I stammered, my voice trembling. "I didn't mean you didn't mean." My mother's voice was sharp, cutting through me like a blade. "Do you think this family is a joke, Sophia?" Before I could respond, my father grabbed a length of cord from the corner. My stomach dropped as he stormed toward me. "Sit down," he yelled, pointing at a chair in the middle of the room. Humiliated, I sank into the chair as he tied my wrists tightly. The rope bit into my skin and I fought back. Tears, laughter, and murmurs rippled through the crowd of relatives. My younger brother Liam leaned against the wall, his arms crossed and a smirk on his face. "This," my father announced, gesturing toward me, "is what happens when you disrespect this family." The humiliation was unbearable. I bit my lip, refusing to cry in front of them. My parents' voices blurred into background noise as they continued to berate me. I wished the ground would swallow me whole. Then the door slammed open. The sharp sound silenced the room. Standing in the doorway was a man I hadn't seen in years. My Uncle Richard, dressed in a tailored suit. He looked like he didn't belong in the chaos of this house. His piercing gaze swept over the scene, lingering on me and the ropes surround my wrists. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. My father straightened his battle, faltering for the first time. "Richard, this doesn't concern you." Richard stepped into the room, his presence commanding. "It does now." The tension in the room was suffocating. As Richard strode toward me, he crouched in front of me, his expression softening. "Are you okay, Sophie?" I nodded, though my throat was tight with unshed tears. Richard stood, turning to face my parents. "Untie her," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. "This is discipline," my mother argued. "She needs to learn discipline." Richard's voice rose slightly, his anger barely contained. "This isn't discipline, this cruelty." My father hesitated, but Richard's glare left no room for argument. Stumbling under his breath, he loosened the ropes around my wrists. My arms fell free, and I rubbed at the red marks left behind. Richard turned to me. "Go pack your things." "What?" My mother's voice rose in disbelief. "You can't just take her." "Oh, I can," Richard said, his tone icy. "And I will. You've proven you don't deserve her. You don't understand." My father started, but Richard cut him off. "No, Peter, I understand perfectly. I've watched you and Amanda tear her down for years. That ends today." My parents exchanged a panicked look. They knew they couldn't challenge Richard. His wealth and influence far outweighed theirs, and they relied on him too much to risk alienating him completely. "This is a mistake." My mother hissed, her face twisted with anger. "The only mistake," Richard said, his voice calm but firm, "is the way you've treated your daughter." He turned back to me, his expression softening again. "You're coming with me. You don't belong here." I followed Richard out of the house, my steps hesitant at first, then quicker as the weight of the room behind me lifted. The cold night air hit my face like a breath of freedom. His sleek black car waited in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the darkness. As we reached the car, Richard opened the passenger door for me. "Get in," he said, his tone firm but kind. I slid into the seat, my heart pounding in my chest. Behind us, my parents stood on the porch, my mother's face twisted in fury, while my father looked stunned as usual. Bravado stripped away, Liam peeked out from behind them, his smirk gone, replaced by something that almost looked like regret. Richard climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The roar of the car drowned out the murmurs from the porch. As we pulled away, I glanced back. Once, just once, to see my mother's silhouette shrinking into the distance. And then they were gone. You don't need to look back anymore, Richard said, his voice steady. You're free now, Richard's estate was like stepping into a different reality. The house stood tall and majestic, surrounded by manicured gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly. The sleek architecture gleamed in the moonlight, and the warm glow from the windows made the mansion feel alive. This is your home now, Richard said as he unlocked the front door and led me inside. The interior was even more breathtaking. High ceilings, polished floors, and walls lined with bookshelves and art. Yet for all its grandeur, the house didn't feel cold or imposing. Felt safe. Come on, Richard said, gesturing for me to follow him up the staircase. He showed me to a spacious guest room with a soft bed, a desk by the window, and a view of the sprawling gardens below. Take your time settling in, he said. We'll talk in the morning. As he left, I sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed. The events of the night replayed in my mind, the humiliation, the anger, and then Richard stepping in like a shield I never knew I had. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope. The morning sun poured through the windows, bathing the room in golden light. For a moment, I forgot where I was then. The memories of the previous night came rushing back. I found Richard in the dining room, seated at a long table set with breakfast. He glanced up as I entered, a warm smile spreading across his face. Good morning, he said. Did you sleep well? I nodded, though my sleep had been restless. Thank you for everything. He waved a hand dismissively. You don't have to thank me, Sophia. What they did to you is wrong. It's my job to make sure you're safe now. As we ate, Richard began to ask me questions, gentle, probing questions about my interests, my dreams, the things I'd never had the chance to explore for the first time. Someone wanted to know who I was, not who they wanted me to be. What do you love? He asked. I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. I used to love writing, I admitted. When I was younger, I'd write stories all the time, but my parents said it was a waste of time. Richard's expression darkened, but his voice remained calm. They were wrong. If writing makes you happy, you should do it. A few days later, Richard sat me down in his study. I've been thinking, he said. You've been through a lot, Sophia, more than anyone should have to. I want you to consider therapy. Therapy, the word felt foreign, almost taboo. My parents had always dismissed mental health as an indulgence for the weak, but Richard's tone wasn't dismissive, it was caring, encouraging. I know it's a lot to think about, he continued, but it could help you. Don't have to carry this alone. I hesitated, but something in his voice reassured me. Okay, I said finally, I'll try. Richard arranged for me to see Dr. Elena Carter, a therapist. He trusted her office was cozy and inviting, a stark contrast to the sterile, intimidating spaces I'd imagined therapy to be. During our first session, she let me talk at my own pace, her gentle demeanor putting me at ease. I've always felt like I wasn't enough, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. No matter what I did, it was never good enough for them. Dr. Carter nodded, her expression kind but serious. That's a heavy burden to carry, but it's not yours to bear, Sophia. Their treatment of you says more about them than it does about you. Her words lingered with me long after the session ended, planting the first seeds of healing with therapy, giving me the tools to process my pain. Richard encouraged me to dive back into writing. He set up a small writing nook in my room, complete with a new laptop and shelves stocked with books on storytelling and creativity. Consider this your space, he said. No pressure, just write what feels right. First, the words came slowly. I hadn't written in years, and the blank page felt intimidating, but as I let myself sink into the process, something shifted. Writing became a refuge, a way to process my emotions and reclaim my voice. One evening, I showed Richard a short story I'd written, a tale of a girl who escaped a tower and found her freedom in the wilderness. He read it carefully, then looked up at me, his eyes shining with pride. This is incredible. Sophia, he said, you have a gift for the first time. I felt like I was more than the girl my parents had tried to break. I was someone with dreams, with talent, with a future. Weeks turned into months, and I began to settle into my new life. Therapy sessions with Dr. Carter continued to chip away at the walls I'd built around myself, while my writing flourished under Richard's encouragement. For the first time in years, I felt like I was breathing fresh air. One afternoon, Richard found me in the garden, a notebook balanced on my knees as I sketched out the outline of a new story. He sat down beside me, handing me a cup of tea. How's it coming along? He asked, gesturing to the notebook. Better than I expected, I admitted. It feels good, like I'm finally saying things I've wanted to say for a long time. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. That's the beauty of writing. It gives you a voice even when you feel like no one's listening. I stared at him, his words sinking in. For so long I'd felt invisible, voiceless, but now with each word I wrote, I felt a little stronger, a little more whole. One morning, as I sat at the dining room table, reviewing a draft of my latest story, Richard handed me an envelope. My name was scrolled on the front in familiar handwriting, my mother's. I found this in the mailbox this morning, he said, his tone neutral. You don't have to open it if you don't want to. My hands trembled as I held the envelope. Part of me wanted to tear it up, to reject any attempt they made to reach out, but curiosity got the better of me. Slowly I opened it and unfolded the letter. The words were clipped and formal, devoid of warmth. My mother wrote about how the family had been concerned about my decision to leave and how they hoped I would reconsider. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain they'd caused, just veiled criticism and an attempt to guilt me into returning. I handed the letter to Richard, my throat tightening. He read it silently, his expression unreadable. You don't owe them anything, he said finally, his voice firm. Remember that? I nodded, but the letter lingered in my mind for days. It wasn't just their words, it was the realization that they still had a hold on me, even from a distance. During my next therapy session, I brought up the letter. Dr. Carter listened intently as I recounted my feelings of guilt and anger, the conflicting emotions that refused to let me rest. It's natural to feel that way, she said. They were your parents. You wanted their love, their approval. That desire doesn't just disappear even when you know they've hurt you. Her words struck a chord. I realized that part of me still craved their validation, even though I knew it would never come. Letting go of that hope was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but it was also freeing. By the end of the session, I felt lighter. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need anything from them. What mattered was the life I was building for myself. As the weeks went on, I poured my emotions into my writing. Richard, ever the supportive mentor, encouraged me to submit one of my stories to a local writing competition. The idea terrified me, but his unwavering confidence in me gave me the push I needed. To my shock, my story won first place. The prize wasn't just a cash award. It was the validation I'd never received from my parents. My work was good. I was good. At the awards ceremony, Richard beamed with pride as I accepted the trophy. This is just the beginning, he said, his voice filled with conviction. You have so much more to give. The high of the award win was tempered by an invitation that arrived shortly afterward, a request for me to attend a family gathering at my parents' house. First, I wanted to ignore it, but Richard convinced me otherwise. You don't have to go for them, he said. Go for yourself too. Show them who you've come. The thought of stepping back into that house filled me with dread, but he was right. I wasn't the same person they tied to a chair. And humiliated, I was stronger now. When I arrived, the atmosphere was as tense as ever. My mother greeted me with a tight smile, while my father barely acknowledged my presence. Liam, as usual, wore his signature smirk. Dinner was a Quiet affair, the conversation stilted and uncomfortable, but as the plates were clear, my father finally broke the silence. So he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, I hear you've been living it up with Richard. Must be nice to have someone else pay your way. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Actually, I've been paying my own way. I'm in a writing program, and I just won a competition for one of my stories. My mother's fork clattered against her plate, and she shot me a sharp look. Writing, that's not a real career. It is for me, I said firmly, and I'm good at it. Richard, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. She's better than good. She's exceptional. You should be proud of her. The room fell silent, the power dynamics shifting in an instant. My parents, for all their bluster, had nothing to say. For the first time, I felt like I had control. Walking out of my parents' house that evening felt like shedding a heavy burden. The air outside was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension inside. Richard walked beside me, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder as if to remind me that I wasn't alone. You handled that well, he said as we got into the car. Thanks, I replied, my voice quieter than I expected. The truth was, I wasn't sure how I felt. Confronting them had been empowering, but it also left a hollow ache in my chest, a reminder of what could never be. They didn't win, Richard added as he started the engine. Remember that? I nodded, watching the house grow smaller in the rearview mirror. For the first time, I felt like I could truly leave them behind. The confrontation with my parents ignited a fire in me. For years, I'd let their voices drown out my own, but now I was determined to speak louder than ever. I poured myself into my writing, using the pain and triumph of my journey as inspiration. Richard noticed my growing focus and suggested I try something bigger, a novel. It's time, Sophia, he said one evening as we sat in his library. You've proven you can tell a story. Now tell your story. The idea terrified me. A novel felt monumental, almost impossible, but Richard's confidence in me was infectious, and soon I found myself sketching out ideas. The story would be deeply personal, a fictionalized account of my escape from the chains of my family and the discovery of my identity. Writing the novel was both exhilarating and exhausting. I spent hours at my desk, weaving together fragments of memories and emotions into a cohesive narrative. Some days the words flowed easily, other days I stared at the blank screen, paralyzed by self-doubt. Richard became my greatest cheerleader. He checked in on me regularly, offering encouragement and feedback when I felt stuck. Remember why you're doing this, he said one evening. This is your story. No one else can tell it. Those words carried me through the toughest moments, and after months of hard work, I finally completed the first draft. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Richard's influence extended beyond emotional support. Using his connections, he introduced me to a literary agent who agreed to review my manuscript. The agent feedback was constructive but firm. The story was powerful, but it needed refining. I dove into revisions with renewed energy, determined to make the story as strong as it could be. Each change felt like chiseling away at a rough stone, revealing the beauty underneath. As I worked on the novel, I found myself processing more of my past. One afternoon, during therapy, I shared a pivotal moment from my childhood, a time when I had tried to stand up for myself, only to be shut down by my parents. They made me feel like I was wrong for even trying, I said, my voice cracking. Dr. Carter nodded thoughtfully. And yet, you're here now. You tried then, and you're trying now. That resilience is what brought you to this point. Her words resonated deeply. I wasn't just writing a story, I was reclaiming my voice, my agency, my life. After months of revisions, I submitted the final manuscript to my agent. The waiting period was agonizing, but Richard reminded me to trust the process. You've already done the hardest part, he said. Now, let it find its place. When the call finally came, I could Hardly believe it a major publisher wanted to pick up my novel. I felt a surge of emotions, joy, disbelief, and a quiet sense of triumph. My story was going to be out in the world where it could inspire others who had felt silence the day the contract was signed. Was surreal. Richard was there with me, his pride evident in the way he smiled and clapped me on the back. This is only the beginning, he said. The publisher scheduled a release date and the promotional process began. Interviews, photo shoots, and marketing meetings filled my days, but none of it felt overwhelming. I was telling my story, and that made it all worthwhile. News of my book's release reached my parents quickly. One evening, Richard handed me another letter. This time it was from my father. The letter was surprisingly brief. He congratulated me on my success, but couched it in backhanded compliments, calling my work unexpected and lucky. It was exactly the kind of response I had anticipated, dismissive and condescending. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Their opinions no longer had power over me. The night of the book launch was a whirlwind. Friends, industry professionals, and even fans of my work packed the venue. Richard stood by my side the entire time, his support unwavering. During my speech, I felt a wave of emotion as I addressed the crowd. This book is a testament to the power of resilience, I said, to finding your voice even when others try to silence you, and to the people who believe in you when you can't believe in yourself. As the book hit shelves, the response was overwhelming. Readers reached out to share how the story had touched them, how they saw pieces of themselves in my journey. Each message felt like a victory, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever felt unseen. As my book climbed the bestseller lists, I found myself thrust into a spotlight I never expected. Media outlets requested interviews, and invitations to speak at events poured in. At first, the attention was overwhelming, but Richard helped me navigate it with his characteristic calm. You're here because you earned it, he reminded me one evening before a live interview. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. Those words became my anchor as I faced the questions about my upbringing, my journey, and the message behind my book. I was honest, though I chose my words carefully, never naming my parents directly. It wasn't about exposing them, it was about telling my story. The more I spoke, the more I felt my confidence grow. I wasn't just sharing my experiences, I was reclaiming them, shaping them into something meaningful. One evening, as I prepared for a book signing event, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Hesitantly, I answered. Sophia, the voice on the other end, was hesitant, uncertain. It was Liam. What do you want? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. I've been reading your book, he said. I didn't realize, I didn't see things the way you did. His words took me off guard. For years, Liam had been my parents' golden child, implicit in their favoritism. Hearing him acknowledge my pain felt surreal. I'm not looking for an apology, I said. If that's what this is about, it's not, he replied quickly. I wanted to say that I'm sorry for how I treated you, for not standing up for you when I should have. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and for the first time I felt a sliver of understanding between us. Thank you, I said softly. That means more than you know. Ian's apology marked the beginning of a tentative relationship between us. He admitted that living up to our parents' expectations had been suffocating in its own way. I didn't realize how much of myself I was losing, he said during one of our conversations. His words resonated with me, and I found myself forgiving him, not just for his complicity, but for his own struggles. We weren't the same people we had been under our parents' roof, and that realization gave us a chance to start a new mon. Later, another letter arrived from my parents. This one was different. It wasn't filled with backhanded compliments or veiled criticisms. It was a rare acknowledgement of their actions, written in shaky, uncertain handwriting. We didn't realize How much we hurt you, my mother wrote. We thought we were doing what was best, but now we see how wrong we were. The letter stirred a complex mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a faint glimmer of hope. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was something. When I showed the letter to Richard, he studied it for a long moment. Before speaking, it's up to you whether you respond, he said, but remember, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting it. Means freeing yourself from their power. I chose not to respond, not because I hated them, but because I didn't need anything more from them. Their acknowledgement, however imperfect, was enough. I had moved on, and I wasn't going back in therapy. Dr. Carter helped me unpack the letter and the emotions that stirred. Closure isn't something they can give you, she said. It's something you give yourself. Her words stayed with me, and over time, I felt the weight of my past lift. I wasn't defined by my parents' treatment of me. I was defined by the life I had built in spite of it. The day my second book was released, a follow-up to my memoir focusing on healing and growth, I found myself reflecting on how far I had come. Richard stood beside me at the launch event, his pride evident. This is your legacy, he said, not the pain they gave you. This, his words brought tears to my eyes. He had been my rock, my guide, and my biggest supporter. Without him, I wouldn't have found the strength to rebuild myself. That night, as I signed books and greeted readers, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for Richard, but for myself, for the courage it took to keep going. Years later, I found myself back at Richard's estate, the place that had become my sanctuary. The gardens were as beautiful as ever, the house still filled with warmth and love. Richard and I sat on the terrace, sipping tea as the sun dipped below the horizon. You've built something incredible, he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. You've turned your pain into something that helps others. I smiled, my heart full. I couldn't have done it without you. Richard shook his head. You did this, Sophia. I just gave you the space to find yourself. As the stars began to appear in the sky, I felt a deep sense of peace. My journey had been long and painful, but it had brought me to this moment, a moment of freedom, love, and self-acceptance. Richard had become more than just an uncle. He was the father I'd always wished for, and together we had built a new kind of family, one based on love, respect, and mutual support.